they asked the question, can you talk about the difference in similarity between the situation we face in driving out the Trump-Pence regime and a situation that would be more open to and possible for revolution? Can one lead to the other, and what should revolutionaries do in the face of this?
Well, okay, I talked about, what needs to happen beginning on November 4th, in terms of what Refuse Fascism has called for, an outpouring that begins with thousands and is sustained as they put it, day after day, night after night, and grows into millions. And the objective of that is not, I noticed that some of these fascists online have said that people are talking about, that this November 4th is a call for a civil war or a call for a violent, attack on the government. That is completely untrue. What is being called for is not a violent uprising against the system. And what is being called for is massive but non-violent, sustained, a movement of people which is determined to create a political crisis and a political situation which leads in one way or another to the Trump-Pence regime being forced out of power, and not through violent means. Okay, that's just to be absolutely clear. And but that still is a question of millions of people getting involved. A revolution does mean, first of all, a revolution requires certain things that do not exist at this time, and I'll get to whether or not they could emerge out of the driving out the regime. But it requires a revolutionary crisis in society where, the divisions that exist within the ruling structures and forces are intensified, and when they attempt to repress the people who are rising up, the repression only leads to more people getting involved in rising up against the powers that be, and it requires that kind of a crisis where people refuse to live under the system as they generally have accepted living. Let's face it. I talked about Harriet Tubman. Even slaves tried to find a way to live within slavery because they had to. And there were actually several hundred slave insurrections, which you don't learn much about it in school here. But there were uprisings of slaves, and Nat Turner, and uprising in New Orleans, and Denmark Vesey. There were rebellions of slaves, but most of the time, the slaves put up with their condition not because it wasn't horrific, but because they had to live. They had to try to find a way to exist under this. And the reason I'm saying that is most of the time, most people, even those really oppressed under the system, put up with living under this system because they don't see a way out. And those, and the way out that's offered is either an illusion or worse, or it doesn't seem realistic to them at a given time. And, a revolutionary situation is brought about by a combination of all the work that's done by revolutionaries building toward it, and what's happening in the larger world in terms of how the contradictions of the system and contradictions between different forces within the country and internationally are affecting things and lead to the kind of crisis I was talking about, where it can be different kind of crisis. It doesn't have to be a deep economic crisis where everybody's unemployed or half the population is unemployed. It could be a political crisis. It could be a social crisis. It's just a crisis where, on the one hand, people feel that they don't have to and don't want to, but don't have to live under the system any longer, and where the ruling powers are not able to rule in the way that they've usually ruled, and are at each other, and also, finding that their attempts to repress the people are not succeeding, but only calling forth more outpouring from the people. For example, even though the revolution in Iran ended up in a bad place with Islamic fundamentalists coming to power, there was a tremendous mass upsurge against the Shah that began in 1978. And at a high point of that mass uprising throughout that country, in one day, the army of the Shah killed 10,000 people. Now, in a lot of situations, that would have been the end of that. That would have put an end in the short term to that uprising. But because things had reached such a point, That actual mass slaughter only called forth millions more people to become more determined to bring down the rule of the Shah. Now, unfortunately, that didn't end up in a good place, but that's the kind of thing that happens when you get to right to the precipice of right to the edge, the ledge of a leap into a revolutionary situation. So that's one of the key ingredients. And then what goes along with that, you have to have a revolutionary people in the millions and millions who are determined that they will not live under this whole system anymore and are willing to put everything on the line for that. Those are, conditions that revolutionaries work toward, but there's also what's happening in the larger world that brings about much of the changes that can ultimately lead to that. And that's a very different thing than what we're talking about in terms of November 4th and driving out this regime. In an actual revolution, which is different than what's being called for, I want to emphasize again on November 4th and what's being built out of November 4th. In an actual revolution, people do have to go up against, look what I was talking about in Iran. The people who rule this country, for example, they believe that their system is the best possible system and any other system is an abomination that will lead to disaster. They firmly believe this. And they have gotten where they've gotten by crushing any attempt to go up against, go up against them in any kind of fundamental way. So when it comes to it, they're not going to say, "Oh, we didn't realize that people were suffering so terribly. We didn't realize that women were being put through these horrors every day. We didn't realize what was happening to LGBT people. We didn't realize that there were a lot of poverty in the world that we were profiting from. We didn't realize what black people and immigrants and other Latinos are being put through. We didn't know about these police murders. We thought they were all justified. We didn't really know they weren't. Oh, okay, now we understand, so we'll just step aside." No, they're going to try to drown in blood any attempt at going up against their whole system to get rid of it. And when it comes to it, people are going to have to meet and defeat that. If you are living in a house that's ruled by a tyrant who beats everybody, especially anybody that gets out of line, if you want to rectify that situation, you have to break the hold of that tyrant over that household. If you're living in a system that rules in the way this system does, that lives by exploiting people and oppressing people and bringing down force against those who pose any serious challenge against it, when it comes to that revolutionary situation, and not a handful or a few thousand even, but millions and millions of people have come to the point where they will not live under this system any longer, then you have to organize yourself in such a way that you can actually defeat and dismantle this armed force that comes down against you. That's what a revolution is. That's what a revolution will require when it comes to it. We're not there at this point. The point of drive out the Trump-Pence regime is not that that's what's being aimed for. Now, this goes back, what's being aimed for is different in the way I talked about it. As I said earlier, a revolution is a very serious thing. It has to be, all of this is very serious, but a revolution above all is extremely serious and has to be approached very seriously and very scientifically. Constantly analyzing where you are in relation to that goal and what are the contradictions that you have to fight through and what is happening in the larger world and among, what are the divisions among the ruling powers? What's happening internationally? How is that affecting things within the country? All these kind of things have to be continually analyzed because, first of all, you have to have a scientific method to analyze them, and second of all, they keep changing. Life does not stand still. Again, I go back to who the hell expected Trump to be president, okay? That's a big change. And it's not something, some people said to us right after the election, "Oh, you guys must be really happy now because now that you got Trump in there, a lot of people are going to feel like resisting." No. This is a terrible situation, and it could get even much worse. But it is a big change that you have to deal with. And life and, society and the world are constantly changing. So you have to approach this very, very seriously and scientifically in order to get to the point where you can actually have a revolution, because in the final analysis, and let me emphasize that phrase, in the final analysis, you cannot resolve all these things that put masses of people through horror within this system. Only by a revolution can that be done. That's why we need a revolution, not because, somebody somewhere, when I was 22, I read a book about revolution and it sounded exciting, so now we need a revolution. No. I mean, I have read about revolutions that are exciting, but the need for revolution doesn't arise out of that. It arises out of the actual conditions of the masses of humanity and the contradictions that are built into the system that mean that these horrors will continually be perpetrated and perpetuated on masses of people. So that's on a revolution. Now, in terms of the relationship between the one and the other, between the immediate and urgent goal of driving out this regime and the question of revolution, I've said that our analysis is that the process of revolution at this point has to go through driving out the Trump-Pence regime. But that doesn't mean it's the same thing as a revolution. The revolution is a completely different thing in the way that I talked about. It's on a whole other level. And it does require different means, and that's not what's immediately before us. Now, obviously, if you see, there's a need for revolution, like we have what we call the 5 stops. Stop, I'm going to just briefly characterize them. Stop the persecution and oppression of black, brown, Native American people. Stop the destruction of the environment by the imperialist system. Stop the hounding and terrorizing of the immigrants. Stop the degradation of women and the enforcing of traditional gender relations and the, discrimination and oppression against LGBT people. Stop wars of empire and crimes against humanity. We didn't come up with these 5 stops because, let's think of something clever that, I know, stops. Let's stops, that's a good thing. What's a good number? 5, okay. No, we analyzed things and said these are the profound contradictions that people that are having horrendous effects on people throughout the world, and they need to be stopped. But we also made the analysis, and we're not trying to trick anybody, that people need to fight against these things now because they're intolerable. But ultimately, they can't be stopped. They can't be eliminated, other than through getting rid of this system. And I've made the challenge. If anybody wants to argue against our position on the need for revolution, tell us either that these 5 stops are trivial and unimportant, and I'd like to hear that argument, or tell us how you're going to get rid of these things and put a stop to these things under the present system. And I'd like to hear that argument too, because I don't believe you can do it. First of all, I believe they're incredibly important, and second of all, I don't believe you can do that within this system, and you can do it within the framework of a radically different system, which is laid out in the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America. So that's why we see the need for a revolution, and we're working scientifically toward that revolution, and to win masses of people to see the need for that revolution, and to themselves become leaders of that revolution by taking up the science that's necessary to do that, and the method. But look, this goes back to an earlier question. What will come out of this? I honestly don't know. There are a lot of different things that could happen. Is it possible that through the whole swirl of this, a revolutionary situation could emerge? Yes, it's possible. If you ask me to sit here now and tell you, is it likely? Well, I don't like to engage in unscientific speculation, but if you twist my arm, I'll say probably not. But we don't know. And I'm certainly not going to rule out the possibility, but that's not the aim of what Refuse Fascism is called for November 4th and building from there to drive out this fascist regime. And, we will continue working toward revolution for all the reasons that I've said, and why we think it's necessary and why we think it's emancipating. But our goal now, an immediate political goal, is to join with many, many others, most of whom do not agree with us at this point about the need for revolution, to achieve the driving out of this regime for all the reasons that I've spoken to, and then we'll see. We'll see what that leads to, and we'll continue to fight for a positive outcome to that even shorter revolution, even as we continue on a more fundamental level to continue working for the revolution that we're firmly convinced is scientifically established as a necessity and as a liberating alternative to the world we live under now.